Okay.
Very good. Welcome, everybody. I think everybody knows each other, but it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Azelina Flint. As you know, Zena joined us this year as lecturer in 19th century literature and creative writing. A sickeningly talented individual who can do lots of different things. Zena's first monograph came out late last year. It's called The Matrilineal Heritage of Louisa May Alcott and Christina Rossetti. It's a book that thinks about the long 19th transatlantic century, I guess. Zena's both an expert in Victorian writing, but also in 19th century American writing, and it's a very fine book. I can highly recommend it. She has an edited collection coming out very soon. I'm going to show my ignorance in not quite knowing how to pronounce May Alcott Nierka's married name. Nierka, there you go. And that's coming out later this year, the edited collection?
End of this month.
And so is that the first edited collection of its kind?
Yeah, it's the first academic book on Louisa May Alcott's youngest sister.
Right, absolutely. And that's the book that in some ways takes you into the session today, because it was about somebody who wasn't just a writer, but primarily a portraitist.
Yes.
And Zena's new project is about women iconographers. So, colleagues, please join me in welcoming Zena.
So I've prepared something terrifically formal, and now you're all here, and I know you all. I feel like a bit of a prat, but I shall plough on. Thank you to John for organising everything today, and thank you everyone for being here. As you know, I was drawn to Lancaster because so many of the researchers here are enthusiastic about cross-disciplinary research that rethinks the relationship between the creative and the critical. And my current research project considers how literary studies and creative writing evolve through drawing on one another's approaches to reading and writing as embodied experiences. So, devotional criticism, women's iconography, and reading as a pilgrimage is a research project that will develop a schematic method for both writing and analysing women's devotional poetry based on the creation of an icon. The project is motivated by my personal desire to develop a model of close reading that takes the mystical experiences of women of faith seriously, in much the same way that creative writers take one another's diverging cultural backgrounds, varying belief systems, and disparate personal experiences seriously in the workshop, where the writer's worldview is seen to be integral to their own creative vision and practice. And much of my research as a feminist scholar and creative writer strives to integrate the religious and feminist visions of 19th century women through exploring how their faith and embodied experiences in prayer shape their feminist advocacy. And my first book, which Andy's just mentioned, recovers the mystical experiences of the authors, Alcott and Rossetti, and their matrilineal communities. That's their mothers and sisters in their life writing and published work. And mysticism is something I describe as an umbrella term that refers to the various ways that the individual experiences their relationship with God and the wider Christian community through prayer, sacramental or liturgical practice, ritual, community, life, study, and the contemplation of creation. When we think of mysticism, we often think of metaphysical experiences like dreams and visions, but the term more properly denotes the everyday experiences that underpin the individual's faith. My book interpreted my subject's mystical experiences through the lens of my own mystical experience when participating in the same sacramental or liturgical practices. And while this was a critical project, I regarded my methodology as being practice-based. So having used my own practice of mysticism as a framework for interpreting women's devotional writing, I now want to develop a methodology that will provide readers with a ritualized process for accessing the mystical experiences recorded in the life writing and poetry of Christian women. And this ritualized methodology will provide a step-by-step guide for writing a poem or critical commentary based on the contemplation of the written testimonies of female mystics. This idea has in part been sparked by the ontological turn in anthropology. The ontological turn starts from the premise that people inhabit multiple realities that are shaped by their cultural backgrounds, social structures, and belief systems. It refuses to privilege any one reality and instead takes seriously modes of experience that are alien to Western secular thinking, such as visions, interactions with non-human beings like spirits, animals, and plant life, and non-linear conceptualizations of time. The ontological anthropologist strives to participate in their subjects' realities through sharing in their rituals and thereby accessing the transcendent reality to which their metaphysical experiences defer. I hope that creating a ritualized method for contemplating the mystical experiences of women of faith will allow both creative and critical practitioners to share in the transcendent realities of these women and to produce work that represents these realities. I've selected icon making as the basis for my ritualized approach because it is underpinned by a strict step-by-step process that incorporates prayer, ritual, and creative practice. The iconographer strives to encounter the figure they represent through rigidly adhering to strict precepts concerning the preparation of their materials, the design of their image, the techniques they deploy, and the forms of prayer they adopt. Participating in this ritualized process allows the iconographer to access the transcendent reality they aspire towards. And once they access this reality, they transcribe it for the pilgrim in the same manner that the female mystic transcribes her autobiographical mystical experiences in her life writing. Crucially, this process is subject to failure. The possibility of failure allows for a skeptical practitioner to productively reflect on why they are unable to access their subject's transcendent reality and to incorporate that experience into their creative or critical work. Icon making is a particularly appropriate model for analysing the life writing of female mystics because it is a form of visual writing. We say an icon is written rather than painted because the iconographer regards themselves as a scribe of divine revelation and their image as a theological statement. In the early church, the symbolic language of icons would be read by a largely illiterate population who would defer to icons to form an understanding of the tenets of their faith. Orthodox Christianity therefore regards the icon as a visual form of writing that enables the iconographer and the pilgrim to encounter the spiritual world to which they act as witness. The development of my method, of course, requires me to experience the ritualized processes of icon making in a workshop, but more pressing, however, is the need to converse with female iconographers to form an understanding of how they experience iconography as a type of mystical spirituality. I have therefore commenced a series of interviews with female iconographers across a range of belief systems. While iconography is based on the iconographer's mystical encounter with the figure they depict, it is also a practice that has historically only been open to men in the Orthodox Church. How then do women negotiate the tension between their belief in the power of iconography to facilitate mystical experience and the imperative that they use a symbolic language that has historically only been open to men? This question drives my study of women iconographers' spiritual journeys and will shape the creation of my methodology. After all, a methodology that strives to access the transcendent reality of Christian women must draw on the ritual practices, experiences, and discourses of women who can provide first-hand accounts of their spiritual lives and experiences, unfiltered by other church authorities or scholarly agendas. My interviews with female iconographers investigate how far women transgress the strictures of the discipline in terms of lifestyle, content, and technique to make a space for themselves within it. These interviews have uncovered a spectrum of views about how an icon is defined, who it is for, the world it depicts, its artistic methods and aesthetic content. Since the icon straddles myriad disciplinary and artistic boundaries, I will first provide a definition of the icon with respect to the various disciplinary debates surrounding it. Having defined the icon, I will then provide an overview of the life stories and practices of two of the female iconographers whom I recently interviewed. I don't have the time to share all of my interviews with you, but the work of the two women I will discuss embodies the most traditional and the most radical responses to the discipline. And finally, I will outline the schematic process of creating an icon in the hope that you may be able to offer suggestions as to how it can be adapted into a model for close reading or even a method for writing poetry. So, to begin then by asking the question, what is an icon? The most succinct definition of an icon is provided by the 8th century theologian and iconophile St. John of Damascus. An icon is a visual image of what is invisible. The iconographer is the scribe of mystical experiences. They are not a painter. They transcribe what cannot be seen or comprehended by deploying a unique symbolic language. At the moment they receive the Holy Spirit, the iconographer expresses the inexpressible through opening a window or door into another world. The representation provided by the iconographer is figurative and not literal, because the world they depict is subject to different metaphysical laws from our own. Icons are perhaps closer to pictographs than to paintings. They are made up of graphic symbols that cumulatively form a divine universal language, a lingua franca that is accessible to all Christian believers. When iconography was first conceived, it sought to express the truths of a recently established and persecuted religion through paying witness to a reality that could not be expressed directly with words or other overt devotional actions. The earliest iconographers accessed this reality through personal recollection. Orthodox tradition teaches that St. Luke the Apostle was the first iconographer of the Virgin Mary. After the first generation of Christians passed away, the faithful of the Byzantine era created images based on divine visions. These visions are regarded as empirical evidence of Christ's physiognomy within Orthodox theology because revelation and experience are held to be the basis for rational thought. Where Western civilization separates philosophy from theology on the grounds that the purpose of philosophy is to ascertain the truth of experience, Orthodoxy presents experience as the basis of understanding. Faith is not an expression of what we do not know, it is rather the evidence of our experience. The early icons, as the testimony of direct revelation, became templates for the design of all future icons and were set down in dogma to preserve the sacred art form. The purpose of the dogma was to record what had been verified by experience. It was the testimony of thought concerning what had been seen and revealed. Orthodox dogma is expressed through a precise language of visual signs by which believers experience the presence of God within the icon. It is imperative that the viewer has a basic comprehension of the vocabulary of the icon's symbolic language before they approach it. The icon provides an image of eternity, a world of completed time, and so the spatial and temporal laws of the material world do not apply. Its use of inverse perspective, a compositional structure where there is no vanishing point towards which all lines converge on the horizon, reminds us that we contemplate an invisible reality that is subject to divine law. The figure at the centre of the image is immortal and resides in eternity. Their physical attributes have been transfigured, and so their appearance does not resemble the earthly body. The eyes, ears, and nose are disproportionately large to represent, respectively, the subject's visual perception of God's presence, their awareness of the divine word as it penetrates the ears of the soul, and their receptiveness to the heavenly fragrance of paradise. Conversely, the mouth is unnaturally small to indicate that the figure is not concerned with earthly nourishment, but seeks first the kingdom of God. The subject's hands communicate to the viewer through a type of theological sign language that is immediately recognised by Orthodox believers. This sign language conveys the icon's theological statement. But iconography is not merely defined by its physical attributes. As a form of spiritual writing, it is a symbolic expression of a highly developed theology that instructs the faithful about how they should access the invisible world that hides itself from their sight. The Orthodox theologian Paweł Florensky argues that iconography is one of the liturgical means by which the believer straddles the boundary between the visible and the invisible. Florensky recognises that we cannot witness the invisible world in its totality until we have been transfigured, but we can glimpse it through occupying the liminal boundary between the two worlds. He argues that, quote, life in the visible world alternates with life in the invisible, and thus we experience moments, sometimes brief, sometimes extraordinary fleeting, sometimes even the tiniest atom of time, when the two worlds grow so very near in us that we can see their intimate touching. Florensky draws a complex analogy between the spiritual ecstasies that occur on the boundary and the act of dreaming. Of course, dreams occur when we sleep lightly on the boundary between sleep and waking, and in dreams we inhabit a different dimension of time. According to Florensky, the progression of time in dreams occurs in tandem with the progression of time in the material world, but within the dreamscape, time flows backwards as well as forwards, from future to past, from effects to causes. So to condense what is a highly complex analysis of the structure of dreams, Florensky posits that the sequence of events within a dream proceeds towards a definitive denouement, but in the waking world, this denouement often occurs as the external stimulus or first cause of the dream. And Florensky provides many examples from his dream diary, and I will share one of them with you now. So that's the sign language, by the way. Today is Sunday, and Divine Liturgy will soon begin. I decide to go to liturgy, but I'm a bit warm from walking. So I decide first to rest in the cemetery next to the church. I start to read the epitaphs, and I notice the bell ringers start to go up the bell tower. The bell must be rung to start the service, but it still hangs unmoving. Then the bell begins to sway, and suddenly it peals out in loud, piercing sounds. So piercing, in fact, that I wake to find that the piercing sound is my alarm clock ringing. For Florensky, this inversion of the sequence of events, and by implication the progression of time, is not coincidental. The dream world, like the world within the icon, is an ontological reflection of our world, the sphere of the imaginary that joins as well as divides this world from a parallel dimension that inextricably influences all that we do. The proper role of art coincides with that of the dream. It enables the artist to witness the super-reality of the invisible realm from the perspective of the boundary. Art functions as a vehicle that projects the artist from the visible to the invisible, and after returning to the material world, the artist records a fragment of what has been revealed in symbolic imagery that transliterates the incomprehensible language of the divine revelation to our limited sight. Thus, one does not contemplate the icon itself, one seeks to identify that which is absent from it in order to travel beyond it. Icons, then, are determined by the gaze of the viewer as much as they are created by the vision of the iconographer. In the words of Catholic theologian Jean-Luc Marion, the icon does not result from a vision, but provokes one. By attempting to manifest the invisible, the icon forces the material object to direct the viewer's gaze beyond itself again and again, ad infinitum. When we contemplate the icon, we expect the gaze to surpass itself by resisting the urge to focus on a single point of convergence. As Marion puts it, the gaze can never rest or settle. It must always rebound upon the visible in order to go back in it up the infinite stream of the invisible. In this sense, the icon makes visible only by giving rise to an infinite gaze. The icon looks out at the viewer. The viewer does not look out at the icon. This is a key distinction between the icon and the idol. The idol consumes the gaze of the viewer and contains the divine within itself as a physical object. The icon defers our gaze to a transcendent reality where the divine is located. Consequently, it is the saint or holy figure that looks out on us through a window into eternity. But while they look out on us, they also partially withdraw themselves from us. Their body has already been subject to transfiguration and cannot be represented literally. The icon will no longer be expressive, signifying, or referential, but will rather incarnate withdrawal itself. Unconcerned with either naturalism or realism, the icon, as Marie-José Monzane argues, is the best historical introduction to the development of abstraction. Yet, by the same vein, the icon must resist the possibility of devolving into a solely abstract image, for to do so would be to deny the reality of Christ's physicality and contradict his very nature by transforming him into a disembodied being. Instead, the icon situates itself between what Monzane terms as the presence of emptiness and the physical body. By signifying both empty and immanent presences, icons emulate Christ's kenosis, his self-emptying, whereby he dispensed with his divine image to take on the form of man and become a servant to the Father. Through kenosis, the natural image of the Father agreed to imitate humanity and made itself similar to us with the exception of sin. Therefore, Christ is twice an image, being both an image of the Father and in the image of man, In early Christendom, iconophiles regarded the rejection of the image as tantamount to a rejection of the incarnation itself. So the summary definition of an icon after all of that, as you can tell, there are whole books written about this, and I got sucked into a bit of a vortex. But to condense everything, we can therefore define the icon as a devotional object that directs the pilgrim's contemplation through providing a visual representation of the invisible. To represent the invisible, the icon makes use of a detailed symbolic language that expresses the subject's spiritual status and their transfigured state. The iconographer deploys both abstraction and realism to convey the dual nature of their subject as both human and transfigured. The subject looks out on the viewer through the icon as a type of portal into another world, and the icon is a window or door into this world, granting us access to a super reality that transcends our own. To access this reality, the iconographer must straddle the boundary between the visible and invisible, and their presence on this boundary is facilitated through fasting and prayer and the ritualized process that underpins the icon's creation, which I will summarize very briefly at the end. But for now, I'm going to briefly explain the role of women in the history of iconography and then talk about the selection of my interviews, which are far less abstract and hopefully more immediately accessible. Okay. So, the Orthodox Church regards the practice of iconography as a sacred vocation that resembles the priesthood. And as such, it has only officially been open to women since the 20th century. In the Orthodox Church, the title of iconographer is bestowed on an artist through a ritual blessing during Mass. After having received this title, the iconographer will serve the bishop, who will become the sole patron of their work, commissioning them to create sacred art for liturgical purposes across the diocese. Prior to the 20th century, women who were interested in iconography could only assist titled male iconographers in their studios. Nuns would occasionally work alongside monks in neighbouring monastic communities, and wives would assist their husbands in household studios. Of course, it's quite possible that women created icons privately, but difficult to ascertain. Iconographers don't sign their work because they are regarded as divine instruments who offer themselves to God, and instead the icon is signed with the name of the event or holy figure it commemorates. And so the names of most male iconographers have been lost to history, with the exception of a few great masters like Andrei Rublev. Today, a woman can be a titled iconographer in the Orthodox Church, but some clergy remain resistant. America's first sanctioned female iconographer, Shirley Contos, received her title in 1986 after encountering considerable hostility from the Orthodox clergy. And the relatively late date of her investiture is a testament to the radical contemporariness of women's iconography as a movement, which has burst out in the last century. Ironically, women are now holding the practice, with female iconographers outnumbering men. Many of these women are not members of the Orthodox community and are therefore technically unsanctioned. They are also working in a tradition that includes very few depictions of women. There are only 14 representations of women in a canon of approximately 500 images committed to Orthodox dogma as the direct revelations of the early church. So I've met with 5 female iconographers from a range of religious backgrounds. They're all English speaking and are from both Britain and the US. And I'm particularly interested in how the United States, a country that prides itself on openness to innovation, responds to this tradition and its historic exclusion of women as compared with the United Kingdom. And my interviews have largely focused on my subject's spiritual journeys, their experiences as women iconographers, their willingness to subvert the parameters of the tradition, and for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to discuss the most traditional and most radical women I've met. There's quite a huge disparity between them. There's 3 women in the middle, but you should get a sense of the kind of broad spectrum of women working with icons. So, Sister Esther, a nun at Turvey Abbey, first encountered icons on the 2nd day of her novitiate when she was sent to the provincialate or main house in Belgium. At that time, many Belgian Catholics celebrated the Eastern Rite. That means they participated in the Orthodox liturgy while remaining Catholic. While visiting her consoeurs, Sister Esther attended services in the Orthodox chapel, where she fell in love with the liturgy and felt an urge to paint icons. On her return to England, she sought permission from her superior to learn the art of iconography, and her request was denied. Like Joanne Manley Hopkins, Sister Esther had to wait a long time before she was given permission to commence her artistic ministry. 15 years, in fact, where Hopkins had to wait a mere 7. They felt that because my attraction to the icons and the liturgy was so strong, I might become an Orthodox, Sister Esther told me. This prediction proved to be true, for she is now unofficially Orthodox, but she still lives in the monastery. She was drawn to the religion by the power of its liturgy and the centrality of icons to its forms of worship, devotion, and prayer. Where sacred images in the Catholic Church are merely used for the decoration of the church, in Orthodox Mass they are part and parcel of the framework of worship, appearing on the door of the church and in the icon screen before the altar. Sister Esther's experience as a female iconographer has largely been positive. Her organisation, the British Association of Iconographers, has been patronised by a Greek Orthodox Archbishop and by the leading British iconographer Aidan Hart. She feels that the only disapproval a woman might receive would be connected to her attempts to disrupt the tradition. Sometimes the Orthodox are not cooperative in that respect, she admitted, and rightly so, because in order to paint icons, I feel strongly that you've got to become immersed in orthodoxy itself, the liturgy and prayer. Some people aren't going to paint icons for the liturgy, which infuriates me a bit because the two are so linked. For Sister Esther, the question of women's experiences as iconographers is inextricably tied to their respect for the Orthodox tradition rather than their gender. When questioned further on how she feels about art that draws on iconography but is not strictly faithful to the tradition, Sister Esther stressed the importance of characterising such art as influenced by the icon, rather than bestowing the title of icon upon it. For her, it is important that this distinction is upheld, because iconography is not about expressing itself. It's trying to get to the root of the expression of the icon, to convey it, and differs from sacred art, which is more influenced by the person's own feelings, and therefore with it, their own expertise and excellence in painting. Conversely, when painting an icon, you've got to divest a lot of your own self and respect the requirements that the iconographer cultivate a disposition of humility. I asked if the ability to reveal the image of the icon came from the ritualized process of the discipline itself, or if something outside the self moves the iconographer while painting. No, she responded candidly. It doesn't automatically happen that way. Sometimes it's very frustrating. You can never be perfect in painting an icon up to the standard of certain iconographers like Andrei Rublev. It is for this reason that Sister Esther characterises herself as painting rather than writing an icon. Notwithstanding her commitment to the special role of the icon in Orthodox liturgy, Sister Esther still values its ecumenical potential. She would disapprove of anyone obstructing a non-Orthodox artist from creating an icon, and acknowledges that some Orthodox Christians would attempt to do so. But if a person wants to, they will become interested, she told me. Often people are attracted to icons and they can't explain it. Something has drawn them or it hasn't. For me personally, I feel people are either drawn to icons or they're not. Why or how or what depends on that person. I asked if part of herself was contained in the image and whether the iconographer strives to meet the pilgrim spiritually in prayer. The answer to this question, she confessed, is difficult to assess because of the requirement of anonymity. Iconography is a challenging practice, and the iconographer must struggle on in prayer, hoping the spirit will touch them. That said, the great master Andrei Rublev moved countless pilgrims with his Trinity icon. But he was a great painter anyway, an exception, she reminded me, and the Trinity icon is the icon of icons. The most tangible way Sister Esther's iconography has allowed her to form relationships with others is through her establishment of the British Association of Iconographers. The purpose of this group is to allow iconographers across the country to come together, exchange ideas, and learn the specialised techniques of iconography, including gilding. It is supported by an annual cross-denominational exhibition, which has gone online in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the publication of a review. Sister Esther has gone from being a novice who was denied the possibility of painting icons to a central figure of the British icon painting scene. So, to move to the other extreme of kind of artistic responses to iconography. And this story has a really great start, and Angela always starts the story in the same way. So, Reverend Dr. Angela Yarber's journey with icons began in 1999 when she was hunkered in a Russian Orthodox church as the American embassy was bombed. As a young evangelical Christian from the American South, Angela had gone with her highly traditional congregation to convert the Russian Orthodox to evangelicalism. I think it's a pretty brave thing to do. During their time in Moscow, the congregation were arrested and subjected to interrogation. Having never experienced iconography and in fear of her life, Angela looked around the unfamiliar Orthodox church for glimpses of hope. Instead, I found glimpses of white men who historically would not have been white and who have been whitewashed, she told me. As she gazed up at the unfamiliar figures with hands raised in, quote, endlessly frightening benedictions, accompanied by symbols she didn't understand, she found herself asking, where are all the women? And this question sparked a journey of discovery and artistic practice concerning iconography that coincided with her own spiritual journey. Raised in the Bible Belt, Angela was invited into a conservative evangelical congregation as a teenager. She was discouraged from pursuing a degree in performing arts at Juilliard because her ministers believed that the arts brought glory to the individual and not to God. Acting on this advice, she enrolled in a religious-affiliated liberal arts college that proved to be moderately progressive. Here, her tutors refuted the wisdom of her ministers and told her that her passion for the performing arts should coincide with her passion for faith. As a professional dancer, she initially studied the history of Christian dance and then went on to pursue postgraduate study in women, gender and sexuality and art and religion. The memory of her early experience with icons remained vivid in her mind, and she undertook a pilgrimage to St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, which houses the oldest collection of Christian icons in the world. And there she confronted an icon of Jephthah's daughter, the nameless child in the book of Judges, who was sacrificed by her father in fulfillment of a vow that he would make a burnt offering of the first person that emerged from his house when he returned victorious from battle. As a feminist theologian, Angela was aware that the story is problematic for a host of reasons. Human sacrifice is not traditional in the Hebrew Bible or in Judaism, and at that time it was customary for daughters and wives to greet warriors singing and dancing on their return. In the Bible, Jephthah's grief is presented as a response to the loss of his lineage rather than the loss of his daughter. In St. Catherine's Monastery, Jephthah's daughter appears at the left side of a triptych that depicts the crucified Christ at the centre and the binding of Isaac on the right. And you can just see it's the moment of her decapitation. It's the oldest icon including a representation of a woman in the world. So, cheery stuff. Angela was struck by the fact that the sacrificed daughter isn't even named, where Isaac is spared and Christ is resurrected. Jephthah's daughter and the Virgin Mary were the only two women represented in the monastery, and Angela again found herself asking the question, where are all the women? In response to these encounters, she created the Holy Women Icons Project, a collection of folk feminist icons depicting revolutionary women and queer saints throughout history. Although these images do not subscribe to the traditional techniques of icon making, Angela uses the term icon as an interfaith word that acknowledges its significance to other faith traditions and its usage in secular popular culture to identify figures who are worthy of praise. Her use of the term is intentionally subversive. It draws our attention to the fact that, quote, she doesn't have a canonization process, but there's a big council of men who decide who is the most holy. Instead, she invites her viewers to join her in consecrating unconventional saints whose lives inspired people with new models of holiness. The series is ecumenical, incorporating social justice and civil rights leaders and goddesses from other faith traditions. Angela deploys a folk style to render her images accessible to secular audiences and to indicate that her subjects are icons of the people. As a feminist artist portraying holy women from a variety of faith traditions, she acknowledges that, quote, there is a sordid history of white women plucking goddesses from traditions outside their own, typically traditions that involve women of colour, and appropriating them for themselves. And one of the ways she tries to counteract that is by centralising the image of the heart. She was telling me that a lot of kind of feminist responses to women's spirituality from other cultures really kind of emphasises the sexuality and the womanliness and kind of brings forward the breasts and hips. And so with the image of the heart, she's trying to show that it's what's inside that matters, and that also these women are, in a sense, emblems for other women as well. The Holy Women Icon series presents the particularity of the history and the culture from which the goddess figure comes through inscribing the icon with what Angela terms as the cry of the woman's heart, in the form of a short poem that captures some of the essence of who that woman was or is, and her story, life, legend, and legacy. It is safe to say that Angela writes icons as theological statements, even if her content and technique is unorthodox. Like a traditional iconographer, she regards the icon as incomplete, a mere entry point or invitation to something that is beyond her comprehension. In this case, the lives and legacies of forgotten revolutionary women and goddesses from other cultures. For Angela, the icon is a site of grace, hospitality, and openness to knowing that she can be wrong in her decisions as an artist. She shares the traditional iconographer's apprehension that she might fail in her objectives. To encourage her viewers to reflect on the icon on their own terms, she presents her work alongside two questions for contemplation. The inward question asks viewers to consider how the woman they are looking at speaks to something inside themselves, and the outward question encourages viewers to think about how they can change the world through participating in acts of social justice, reform, protest, and allyship. For example, the questionings accompanying her icon of Jephthah's daughter are: have there been times in your life when your dances of greeting have morphed into dances of lamentation? And how can you prevent other girls and women from being sacrificed at the hands of foolish violence? And you can see with this particular icon, Jephthah's daughter's inside the broken heart, the heart that's been broken by her father. And it's kind of a self-portrait as well that speaks back to Angela's background as a dancer. Angela's icons are therefore subjects of secular devotion that encourage the viewer to learn more about who is represented. For viewers in a faith tradition, their interaction with the icon can be an act of devotional piety. For secular viewers, it can be an act of learning. Learning, for Angela, is a sacred act and devotional practice. The liminal status of her icons as both secular and devotional speak to her own faith position as a strategic theist. After serving in the Baptist Church as an ordained pastor for 14 years, Angela left her congregation when she and her wife received homophobic hate mail and death threats. Just as a post-structural feminist uses the language of essentialism to strategically import marginalised women, Angela uses the language of theology to support marginalised individuals of faith. As she puts it, if I have a queer person who comes to me and they have been abused and disowned by their family for their queerness because their family believes they're going to burn in hell, I'm not going to look at them and say, well, you know, God is a social historical construct, and so this really shouldn't matter to you, because that would be rude and it would not be helpful. But instead, I will take their hands in mine and pray with them, and I will use the language of God, and I don't feel that's being hypocritical. It's strategically calling upon the name of God on behalf of someone else. Today, Angela remains an ordained pastor because there are few queer, part Mexican female pastors who have had the privilege of ordination. She wants the communities she represents to be able to see reflections of themselves in religious spaces. And for this purpose, she is coming to the Priory to lead a workshop and exhibition in June. Some of the images that will be there. So to finish up then, you'll be pleased to know that I've really gone for excerpts of the icon making process, and I'm just going to run through them very quickly. I've picked up 5 of 20 because it's very involved. But here are some of the basics. Icons are painted using the egg tempera technique. It's very symbolic. You separate the egg from its white, and the egg represents the potential for life, and the pigment represents eternity. And together these substances create divine images that mingle flesh and spirit. And while iconographers paint, they pray the Liturgy of the Hours, they listen to Gregorian chants, study theology, fast, and they also talk to their subject at the same time. First thing they do is choose the wood. The wood represents the cross and the altar, and they're supposed to contemplate the subject in prayer as they sand it down. Then they create the gesso, which is a white home, a pure surface for the subject. The wood's also covered with linen, which is like an altar cloth, and during this period they contemplate the enormity of their vocation. And then they draw the lines, and there's this whole theology of the line. Essentially, there's a whole debate about whether the line contains the divine presence. It's not supposed to, so it's supposed to be a fluid line. So that's achieved by sketching it on the surface, puddling the paint on top of it. See huge, like almost abstract puddles of paint. And then the light, you change the design according to how the paint sets. And that's kind of like a rationale for the image emerges through the paint. And it gets even more complex because like every line has a particular meaning. So it's like read like a poem, and that's like just 4, but there are 20. So apparently if someone Orthodox looks at that, they can just read a whole theological statement through that. And there's also colour symbolism as well. And then there's the highlights. So the method of painting is you paint from dark to light. There's no sun or extorsive light in the painting because they're already transfigured. So you go through three stages of highlights and 3 stages of glaze, and like the passing of day to night. And it takes many days to complete. And then the final thing you do is you sign the icon with the name of the subject, not with your own name, because it's their image, not yours, and they are visual prayers, and therefore the subject must remain anonymous. So that's it. And I managed it in 45 minutes, so I know you were all worried, but there we go.
Thanks, Ina, just such fascinating material presented. Great energy on a Wednesday. I'm sure there are a riot of questions to ask and lots to think about. Does anybody have an opening question?
I was intrigued by the way the insistence on the metaphor of transcribing. You know, why is that? Why do they insist that they're transcribing the subject rather than or the experience, or rather than painting the subject?
Yeah, I've come across loads of different reasons for that, and I don't think anyone really agrees, to be quite honest, but it is standard practice to say you write an icon rather than paint. So some people think it's just because of the whole idolatry thing. So like if you're transcribing, if you're writing, then it's not an idol. That's one theory. The other theory is that because you're supposed to be coming from a place of humility and it's not your own kind of self-expression, you're transcribing what's been revealed to you rather than designing it yourself. So it's taking yourself out of the equation as well. And then someone even said to me, it's like a direct reference to, I shall not engrave an idols, that kind of thing as well. So, but yeah, there's a few different competing theories about that.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? I mean, you because intuitively you might think, well, it's to transcribe is just as kind of mimicry. It doesn't really get you easily out of the trap of mimicking, a graven image.
Yes, that's true. But that's kind of conquered by the abstraction. Because that's why it's supposed to be non-representational. Yeah. So that's why you have the schism, like part of the main reason for the schism between the Orthodox and the Catholics, because Catholics believe in a realistic representation.
Right, yes, and
whereas the Orthodox see that as quite blasphemous. So
it's an interesting insistence in the metaphor, isn't it, writing? And yet they talk. You mentioned briefly towards the end you might converse with your subject as you're painting him, her.
They'll have a template and they'll get up from the time they get, so they'll be working on it all day, and then the last thing they do before they go to bed is put it in front of the bed for their sleep. And then the first thing they do when they get up in the morning is start having conversation. Just like, sounds great. Because it's as I said, it's a window into another world. So it's like a free kind of contemplative prayer form.
Yeah, I mean, writing is so suspicious. This is obviously Derridian territory, isn't it? Writing is so suspected in the Western tradition. The letter killeth, but they're kind of interestingly determined to insist on that trope.
Yes.
Which is well, that takes you exactly. That's very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Jen.
I'm curious about the second of the iconographers that you talked about. I've forgotten her name.
Angela.
Angela. Does she have some version of the process that you've described with the egg yolks and the wood and the linen, and she seems to be using different materials?
It's completely different, but she's created her own process. So
is it
yeah.
analogous? And I guess I'm interested in the fact that the process itself is quite codified, and the materials are, and the order in which things are done. She's got something like that.
She's got something like that, but it's not based on the original process. So she's copied the idea that you have a process and you create like a stylized image, and that's why you can see her images use a particular style. But her emphasis is that she wants something that anyone can learn. So in her workshops, she models this, and you're supposed to be able to learn it within 2 to 3 hours, because she really wants these to be replicable, so people can create their own icons, their own saints, depending on whoever inspires them.
So the materials that she uses, are they part of her, I don't know, is it like the same sort of paint, the same sort of...
I actually don't know. I need to ask her that, but she's coming. I can have more extended conversations.
They look very
It's
different.
just, yeah, they do, they look really different, and it's just really intriguing that, for me, that it's not only like the order in which things are done, but the state that you are in when you do it, and the materials that you use, they're all important in different ways.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you.
I had a sort of quick question about, so her name was Angela, and all the eyes were closed, weren't they? And they're quite optical centred, aren't they? You had that really interesting quote from Jean-Luc Marianne about the thing that the icon is something that gazes out.
Yes.
So I just wondered what you make of the fact that this, I was going to say a rogues gallery, but that's the wrong, this wonderful showcase of iconic female, that they all had their eyes closed. Is that sort of...
Yeah. I think from the conversations I've had with her, I think that's something to do with, like, she really wants the viewer to be able to identify with them or feel that they're somehow part of them. So I guess it is similar to the original icon in a way. It's reversing that. It's almost like our gaze draws us into them, I think, rather than the opposite.
Interesting.
Is she because I can imagine being your first iconographer and going, they're not icons, they're postcards. And seeing a very different, and I can imagine the other one was something, no, I'm sorry, it's open to art. And where do you draw your line?
Good question. I was thinking about this, and I think it depends on what you favour, whether you favour the method or the actual, like, conceptual definition. It's like, if you favour the conceptual definition, that it's about depicting the invisible, forming a relationship with the saint, then I think what Angela's doing isn't as like subversive as it initially appears, because there's the idea of the written image, and even like canonizing images, canonizing the people, that's quite an ancient thing as well, because historically people could declare saints on their own. But if you're someone who's really about the practice and it's the method that makes the icon, then you won't like that. So I'm kind of in between, because I'm drawn to both. Hope you could tell from the talk. I think the theoretical stuff is really, really cool, but I kind of like the process too. So I really like all of their work. And I guess I do think it's whatever you want to term it as, I guess.
One thing I noticed with look at this on more classical icons is, you're right, they never look you in the eye. It's not like the Mona Lisa where, is she flirting with me? But the icons always like, might be bored in what I'm saying, it looks over my shoulder or away or whereas And her icons too, you're right, they weren't meeting our gaze, they had their eyes closed. It seems important, and I think that's really interesting that they don't look at you, they're not engaging with you. Or somehow, maybe they are, I don't know, is that what it is? They don't, am I just being mad? They don't meet you in the eye, isn't that an
Yeah,
artistic
because
decision?
they're trying to force you to keep engaging with them. It's the
Mm.
kind of, yeah. To ask like what I prefer, so there's another woman who I've been interviewing, and she's my favourite. She does traditional icons, but from the Gnostic Gospels, so like feminist scriptural text, and kind of offering an alternative view of theological history. And I like that kind of meeting of the traditional and the subversive together. That's kind of my preference, I guess.
Is version just non-institutional blasphemy? I mean, at what point is blasphemy possible in an icon?
Yeah, but everyone, I mean, this is one of the things that draws you to it. Everyone defines it differently. Like some people would say if you're not sanctioned, if you've not had that ordination thing, like so if you're like Catholic iconographer, that's blasphemy. So you can be really traditional, and so that's again why I'm interested in this, is that every woman doing this is in some sense kind of being quite subversive, even someone who's really traditional. So where you define that blasphemy would depend on your own views.
Do you know anything about Angela's reception among more orthodox iconographers, what they've made of her and made of her work?
Yeah, interestingly, I think most of the other female iconographers are quite interested, even if they don't agree. I think they are just really enthusiastic about anyone like engaging with the tradition and having ideas about it. But one thing I've got from talking to all of the women is that there's like a coterie of like Orthodox clergy who are just out to stop anyone who's not like really traditional, and not just women but men as well. And it's quite funny because in order to be an iconographer, you have to study with a titled iconographer. So these women, even if they're not titled, they've studied with someone Orthodox. So these men like offer classes to women that the women pay for, but then will like tell them afterwards, but your work is not really an icon. So there are these like divisions in the community, and which again is something else that's why I'm really interested.
In many ways, like academia.
Yeah.
I think we fit on quite an awkward area now.
That's quite a boring question. So using the term orthodoxy quite loosely, is there a kind of Russian, Greek, is this which of those traditions did it come from, or is it not that specific?
So the Greek is the most ancient,
Right.
and the Russian has its own style.
Yeah.
But it still will use like the template designs that have been passed down.
Are they distinct traditions that the iconographers engage with, or is it?
Yes,
Yeah.
they are. Yeah. But to be honest, I don't know if there's another divide within that. That's not something I've gotten into yet. And that's something I've been wondering, should I actually get into the whole Orthodox warren of, titled iconographers? But then I don't speak Greek or Russian, and I don't know, I just feel like that's another whole can of worms, and you've got to limit what you're doing in some way. So.
Can I ask a quick question? One kind of derivation of icon that I don't think you used was iconoclast, which is we use a huge amount in popular culture, the idea of an image breaker. Do you think that any of your iconographers are breaking images in order to remake them? I wonder if Angela in part is doing that, or what she's doing is kind of more kind of reparative or therapeutic than that.
That's an interesting question. What do you mean by breaking images?
Well, I mean, there's a literal sense in which, Protestants who kind of only have a walk-on part in this version in a way, would smash images up. Yeah. But I suppose the idea of we think about acts of rewriting or adaptation or whatever, that certain images are not necessarily inverted. I don't mean it in that kind of quite heretical way, but but kind of imaginatively restructured in a way that we might think is a way of breaking the image.
Mm. Yeah, I would say that's a pretty good description of what Angela was doing, and even on the level of the subject she selects as well, I think is a way of, because she feels that there's a model of holiness or a model of how you live your life that's like implicit in the subject. So purely in the act of choosing the subject, she's breaking the image. The same with Mary Jane Miller, the other iconographer I mentioned, who works from the Gnostic Gospels. She's doing something similar as well, I think. Although she would argue the Gnostic Gospels are valid records of revelation, so in fact she's not. It's just being.
But it does challenge a certain kind of limited canon, if that's not tautologist anyway. But it's opening up the range. Well, it's past. I don't know if anybody has any final questions or whether I should just join in thanking Zena once again for a really fascinating talk, and look forward to hearing more about that. So Angela's coming in June. Very good, and there'll be an exhibition in the Priory.
Yes, and a workshop as well.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, thanks so much, Zena.